Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, myth and magic fans and fantasy fiction authors, especially new ones who are thinking of writing your first fantasy fiction novel this November in the NaNoWriMo month-long novel writing challenge. I talked about writing acoustically in the preparation for your NaNoWriMo project during the month of October, also known as Preptober. And continuing along those lines, I wanted to discuss the second part of the ABCs of applied writing, as I call it. And I wanted to talk about building a baseline structure, because B stands for building a baseline structure. Now, many non-writers believe that a novel has a chronological format. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And I suppose most non-writers believe that's true because that's how they read the novel. It's fairly unlikely they're going to dip into the middle, then go to the end, and then go to the beginning. They read it from page 1 all the way through to the end. But I prefer to look at the unprocessed novel, and I'm talking about from a writer's perspective here, as a set of useful ideas that are pegged together somewhat haphazardly. Now, a helpful allegory for this is a washing machine that's filled with clothes. Take each article of clothing from the drum, and you can see how it has its own colour, its own texture, its own shape, its own sound, and even its own smell. Each article of clothing has a unique purpose. Each article has a role to perform, if you like, in life. Even though they're all stuck together in the washing machine or in the washing basket, each one is unique. Now later we might peg these individual pieces of clothing onto the washing line, and this act might create another new thing. It might create a line of ribbons or a line of flags. You could picture a washing line, and I'm talking about an old-fashioned straight washing line, by the way, not a whirly washing line, but you could picture a straight washing line with the colourful clothes hanging off it, like something along the lines of a line of prayer flags in the Himalayas, or like flaming jewels, or like decorative streamers bouncing in the breeze. And if you look closer, you'll see that it's made up of identifiable items, the items of clothing. And yes, a washing line does have a beginning, and it has a middle, and it has an end, but you see it in its entirety. You see it as one conceptual thing. Although perhaps you will put the lighter items in the middle, so that the heavy items don't weigh the whole structure down. But the laundry person, which is what the writer is in this allegory, the laundry person can choose how to hang those articles and in which order they should go on the line. Hope I'm not stretching this too far for you. And as a slight aside here, just to help you get your head round washing lines and hanging language on a line, have you ever thought about washing your own clothes and then hanging them on the line alphabetically, for example, or hierarchically, or taxonomically, or even by colour code? It sounds ridiculous, but we do that with our chapters and we do it with our words. We try to codify them. Me, when I'm doing my washing, I'm not talking about writing at the moment, when I'm doing my washing I normally grab the next item in the basket and I hang it on the line, probably inattentively, almost unconsciously, I suppose, truth be known. So a novel is a set of useful ideas. Each idea has its own distinct personality, but it's a set of useful ideas that can be pegged onto a line later. But the problem is, and the reason I want to discuss the baseline structure is, the problem is, where do you get those ideas from in the first place? And then where will you place them before they can be lined up? So what I thought I'd do is give you some tips that might help. So the first tip is this: introduce your main characters to yourself, because you don't know each other right away, and you might both be a little shy, or certainly a little bit cautious of each other to start with. So perhaps start with their profile. Think about their profile, like a profile you'd have on the social network, and maybe make a profile picture for them, or find a profile picture which suits them, and then stick that picture on your mood board. And think about simple things that you'd want to know about any character that you've just come across. What's their favourite food? What type of books do they read? What's their best feature? What question are you bursting to ask them? Allow them about 100 words to introduce themselves, as if you're on a speed date, and write those 100 words down. The second tip I want you to do is to get acquainted with your character by allowing that character to relate or retell a story of a real incident that happened to them. Because I've found that a good way to learn about somebody is to listen to their story of an experience that they have been through. Now, it doesn't have to be light-hearted, but on the other hand, it doesn't have to be heartbreaking either. It's just a tale that they like to tell to strangers. And we're used to listening to people telling us about their little escapades or their little indiscretions or their hijinks on television, because it's the sort of thing that is on TV shows all the time. And it's a technique that's often used by game show hosts, for example. Game show hosts will often ask a contestant a question like, "What's the worst thing that happened to you while you were at work?" Or, "Tell us about a holiday that went madly wrong." Or, "You said that your hobby is cycling. Have you ever cycled in entirely the wrong direction and became hopelessly lost? What happened? How did it feel?" So allow your main character to retell their anecdote to you. And it doesn't have to be notable, and it doesn't have to be fabulous. As I say, it doesn't have to be heartbreaking. It's just a few snappy words, 100, for example, that I would like you to write down. And this will help you understand that character better. The next thing I want you to do is familiarise yourself with the world in which they live. You already know a little bit about them, but you will want to think about the environment in which they operate. Is their world anything like ours? If it's not, how does it differ? And if it is different to us, are there any similarities? And are there any peculiarities that are very, very special and unique about their world? What are their biggest threats? When do they feel most blessed? What challenges do they face? Is there menace in their world? Where does that danger come from? Is there joy and pleasure in their world? Where does that come from? What brings your character a sense of cheer and gladness? Are they alone in their world? Or do their partnerships or their teammates or companions or other relatives, for example, bring them some solace? Do they have dependents? Do they have, or are they caregivers? Do they have sweethearts? Do they have playmates? Do they have paramours? Do they have parents? This is important. And how do those parents treat them? And learn about their greatest desires. They say that desire is the cause of all suffering. So although you might want to be tactful and discreet about asking a question along these lines, because you've only just met your character, sometimes a straightforward question is often the best way to go. So ask your character this: what is their greatest desire? Because once you glean that information from them, and you might need to tease it out a little bit, but once you glean that information from them and then you distill it into as few words as possible, in other words, you write their greatest desire down on a piece of paper and stick it on your mood board, you'll know that that is their goal. And what stands in their way of that goal? If that last thing that you stuck on your mood board was their greatest desire, then it manifestly means that they haven't got it yet. They haven't got the thing they most want. So what's stopping them getting it? Is it their own limitations? Is it their own shortcomings? Or is it someone or something else that gets in the way of their dreams? Is it, for example, a lack of skill or skills, or a lack of money, or not enough freedom, or some incapacity, or some impotence, or some inexperience, or bad luck, or bad upbringing, or the fact they're just not qualified. There might be one or more reasons for why they haven't managed to, so far, gain their greatest desire. So listen to them and then list those reasons, because once you've done that, you'll know the conflict in your novel. And then I want you to learn about their opposition. Now, you may have met and learned a little bit about your main character, but I would like you to ask them, who is their main opposition? In other words, who is the person who's most responsible for standing in the way of them achieving their greatest desires? And remember, it doesn't have to be a mortal enemy or some despicable arch criminal type. It might be their parent, or a former friend, or a neighbour, or a classmate, or even a soulmate. All these people, and probably with the best of intentions, might be resisting or countering their best attempts at achieving their desires. So do you see how you've now chosen your main character's opponent, and that opponent may well be very close to them. It may well be their best friend or their sweetheart. So congratulate yourself after you've done that, because you've just chosen the antagonist for your story. And that is how to build your baseline structure. This week I wanted to talk about orphaned protagonist tropes and about how not to use an orphaned protagonist trope in your fantasy fiction. We've all seen it, haven't we? It appears over and over and over again in fantasy literature. The orphan hero who must undertake a quest, lone and lost in a grown-up world. Frodo, Lyra, Suki Stackhouse, Arya Stark and Jon Snow, Harry, Pip, Oliver. Sometimes the orphaning moment becomes the inciting incident that pushes the hero into his or her quest. Sometimes the orphaning event supercharges the child hero so that the child is driven and empowered to do things like an adult might and to grow up faster than perhaps nature intended. And sometimes the orphaning gives the child decision-making powers and freedoms they would not otherwise possess if they came from a normal home. So it's a convenient way of bringing a teen person into a story without having to worry too much about the parents being there to guide them, direct them and protect them. It's a stale trope though, and if you use it, you'll be guilty of triteness and of blatant knock-offery. So I recommend that you don't. And I want you to consider these reflections before you consider using a orphaned protagonist. And here's my reflections. Kids raised in decent households still have issues, don't they? And kids raised by loving parents still face problems, don't they? And nice kids, even those who do their homework on time, they still indulge in fantasies, don't they? And how childish must a child be? Do we underestimate the aptitude of a teen? And kids can expertly balance their parents' expectations with their own adventurous inclinations, can't they? And kids don't have to leave home to save the world, or leave home and leave behind their parents to start a mission. So think of Greta Thunberg. And quests can be completed in stages and in instalments without leaving home and without turning your back on parents. Kids don't have to be orphaned to feel disadvantaged. And even kids with a stable family life and with good parents experience conflict and drama, don't they? And must a kid prove herself or himself by becoming an adult before their time, or are there other ways to prove their worth? Now, I remember when I was a kid, I was bullied at school, and I endured it alone because I didn't want to burden my parents with my own petty worries. Looking back on it, I think it was probably a bit dangerous and a bit silly not to trust an adult, especially a loving parent. But it's easy to see this in hindsight and with my now parenting hat on. But I want to bring this up because I came from a very respectable home. I had 2 loving parents at home. However, even though I had all of those benefits, I still got myself into trouble. I had many close shaves, and looking back at it, I had tons of daring and reckless gallivanting adventures. And I never stopped daydreaming and planning new adventures for myself. Now, I'm a real person. I'm not a character from one of my own fictions, so there must be plenty like me. And thinking about it now, I guess my sisters, I have 3 sisters, but certainly the 2 which are closest to me in age, probably had their own dangerous capers too. And like mine, those capers probably included long hikes across wide open spaces, scavenger hunts, daring nocturnal exploits, and other wonderful stories, including romances. Now, I guess the difference between you and me, especially if you were born from the 1980s onwards, is that I was born in Great Britain in the 1950s and I was raised in the 1960s. And back then, and I know this makes me sound ancient, but back then kids were free to roam. And parents weren't as clingy and as protective as they seem to have become in the intervening years. And there's probably some reasons for this. I don't know all of them, but I know for a fact there were few cars around in the 60s when I was brought up. On my street, there was only one person who owned one car. There was a number of people who lived in the street, but there was only one car. And there was not much crime. I mean, there were crimes, and there were quite bad crimes, but they were few and far between. And of course, not many people had a television. We had no television. I don't think anybody in my road had a television. There were no home phones, kiosks on the corner perhaps, and obviously there were no computer games. And this means that me and my sisters, we had to make our own fun. And that would mean colouring, drawing, reading and writing on rainy days, because that's the only things we had, and going for long walks and adventures if the weather was better. And like most of my pals, and I'm not just talking about me, by the way, this is everybody I knew, we were not only allowed to roam all over the countryside and go around the streets, we were actually cajoled into getting out there into the big world. We were told, in no uncertain terms, to go out and play. We were expected to go out and adventure. And in fact, I remember my parents often saying, well, we don't expect you to be back until tea time. Off you go. Don't come back. And this was quite normal. All of my friends were treated the same way. It wasn't because my parents were particularly unsuitable. All parents had the same attitude to their children. So I suppose if you're writing fantasy fiction and you don't want to go down the old stale trope of having an orphan protagonist having to go on a quest, then a good way to depict the same sense of freedom and the enriching, although obviously dangerous, youthhood that I had and I enjoyed, is to set your tale in earlier days, where the parent can be around, the parent can be present, but there's much more freedom and scope for adventure for the child. Now, if the children of the early 1960s were as free and carefree as I just suggested, and I've no reason to lie about it, and their parents were as relaxed about the dangers as they seem to be, then what must childhood have been like in the 1930s? Now, I've read stories about British school-age children being brought up in the 30s, and they searched bomb sites for unexploded bombs, and they rummaged around looking for live bullets, which they would save in their bedroom. They would poke dead bodies to see what would happen. They would find bits and pieces of human remains in the rubble. They'd rifle through bombed out houses looking for the now dead occupants' treasures. So it was a pretty dangerous time to be brought up in the 1930s, and the children then did have a lot of freedom. But I'm not suggesting that the parents weren't around, it's just that there was more freedom and less concern about danger. Or how about setting your story in the 1880s? For example, back then a child would probably be expected to work, and possibly even 6 days a week, and a boy might toil with his father or grandfather in a mine, or on his dad's ship, or in a family mill. A boy would be an apprentice probably, and could be an apprentice to a parent who travels the kingdom, perhaps staying in dodgy taverns. A girl of the 1880s might do all the laundry for her household, or even an entire street. She might nurse siblings, she would housekeep for her mother, she might care for elderly relatives, she'd work in the family business. What I'm suggesting here is if you use a little imagination, you can think of a way to build a convincing family life around your child hero, but without making him or her an orphan. And that's if you set your novel in the Western world. If you set your novel in Europe, Great Britain, United States of America, Australia, Canada, then why not set it 100 years ago or just 50 years ago? But if you want to set it in modern day, think about raising your child hero in a place like Aleppo, which is Syria, or Yemen, or on the Ivory Coast. Then even in the 21st century, your child protagonist will experience events that will be familiar to British children brought up in the 1930s. I just want to finish this topic on some thoughts about parents and parenthood, because I might have suggested just now that my parents were distracted or indifferent, but they were like all parents who lived in our area. They were probably having their own adventures while I was having mine, and I would like to think that they were probably dealing with their own set of catastrophes and collapses. Don't think for a second it was easy for them. Don't forget that they had just come out of the Second World War. Now, I never thought to ask what things that they were dealing with, because you wouldn't. But it's probable that they were too frazzled and ground down by work and life to be what we would now consider to be better parents. It's probable that they were emotionally not present. It's probable that they were physically worn out. It's probable that they were people who got easily distracted by other things. It's possible that they had their own frailties, including some addictions. And it's likely that they were scatterbrained or unengaged or uncommitted or inconsistent or addle-brained or even clueless. It's possible they were all of those things, but it doesn't mean to say that they weren't there. A parent can be one or more of that list I just gave, but they could still be parenting in the broadest sense, and they could still be loving and affectionate people, and they could be loving and affectionate to their offspring, and they could be providing a safe home, but they are not necessarily operating as we would understand a parent to operate. Do you see what I'm getting at? These are just some thoughts, but you don't need to make your child hero an orphan. You don't need to do it at all. Just use a bit of imagination and you can still give them the freedom that they need to go on their quest.